This story is narrated from the journal of Elias Harper. To those who read this, do not pity me, nor think me mad. I am both sinner and victim, bound by a memory that gnaws at my soul, even as I approach my final breath. In the year of our Lord 1692, something dark crept into the bones of White Hollow. We whispered of witches, but we saw only glimpses, fleeting and terrible. You may find my words hard to believe, but know this: there are places and people that ought to be left alone. This is my confession. Pray, heed its warning. It began with the frost, though it was late spring. The fields should have been green, yet a chill lingered in the air. Our wheat turned brittle, and the lambs were born weak. The Reverend said it was a test of our faith, but the villagers muttered darker things. I was 17, apprenticed to my father on the farm, my days spent in the furrows and my nights by the fire. Life in White Hollow was hard, but it was predictable, at least until she came. Marjorie Wren. She arrived on foot, wrapped in a black cloak, carrying little more than a bundle of herbs and a weathered satchel. A widow, she said, looking to make her way south. She stayed at the edge of the village in a lean-to abandoned by a trapper years before. At first, people spoke kindly of her, how she knew the ways of plants, how her tinctures healed sores and eased colic. But then came the accidents. The miller's eldest daughter was the first. A fever gripped her without warning, and no poultice could bring it down. Then the Reverend's prized calf died in its stall, its eyes open and glazed. By midsummer, White Hollow buzzed with quiet hysteria. We didn't dare name it aloud, but every whisper carried the same thought: witchcraft. I didn't believe it, not at first. I thought of myself as reasonable, a skeptic even, though I rarely said so aloud. My father warned me to steer clear of Marjorie, but I was curious. She walked the woods often, picking wildflowers or digging at the roots of trees. I followed her once, or tried to. Her steps were quiet, her movements deliberate, and I quickly lost her among the thick pines. When I returned to the path, my chest tight with embarrassment, I heard her voice. "Why do you follow me, boy?" I spun around, finding her no more than 10 paces away, her gray eyes cold as slate. I wasn't. Her lips twitched, though not in a smile. "Stay where it is safe." Then she turned and vanished into the woods as easily as a shadow. The hollow elm stood at the edge of the village, a great gnarled tree older than the town itself. Its roots twisted like snakes, and its bark was blackened in places, as though touched by fire. It was said witches were hanged there long ago, their curses sinking into the soil. Most avoided it, but the tree had always fascinated me. Its branches seemed to stretch toward the sky in defiance, and the air around it felt heavier somehow. One evening, Tobias Pratt came to me with a plan. He was older than me, braver too, or so I thought. "We'll scare her," he said. "Marjorie Wren. She walks near the hollow elm every night. We'll lie in wait, make her think twice about staying in White Hollow." It was a foolish idea, but Tobias had a way of making folly sound like adventure. There were 5 of us in total. Myself, Tobias, his sister Sarah, and 2 other boys, Samuel and Ephraim. We brought no weapons, just a lantern and a rope, though I'm not sure why. Perhaps it was part of the performance, or perhaps some darker instinct had taken hold. We gathered beneath the hollow elm at dusk. The sun bled across the sky, staining the clouds a deep crimson. Tobias handed me the lantern, its flickering flame casting uneasy shadows. "Quiet now," he hissed. "She'll hear us." The hours passed slowly, the chill seeping into our bones. Samuel whispered that we should leave, but Tobias shushed him. The wind rustled the branches above us, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Then we saw her. She came from the woods, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. She moved with a strange grace, her steps almost silent, despite the crunch of frost underfoot. Her head tilted slightly as though listening to a melody we couldn't hear. None of us spoke. I don't think any of us breathed. Marjorie stopped at the base of the tree, her hand brushing the bark. She stood there for a long moment, her back to us. Then slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes found us immediately. It was impossible. We were hidden among the roots, crouched low in the shadows, yet her gaze pierced through the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm but calm. Tobias rose first, his bravado faltering. Just a warning," he stammered. "You don't belong here, Marjorie Wren. Leave White Hollow or else." The others stood too, emboldened by his words, though none of us moved closer. I stayed crouched, the lantern trembling in my hands. Marjorie didn't answer. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, the lantern's flame guttering. "You're just children," she said softly, her voice laced with something like pity. "Go home." But Tobias wasn't satisfied. "You'll go or we'll make you." He raised the rope, as though it were some kind of weapon. Marjorie's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed darker now, like storm clouds rolling in. "Fools," she murmured. "Do you think the tree will protect you? Do you even know what it is?" The word sent a chill through me, though I couldn't say why. Tobias stepped forward, raising the rope higher. That's when we heard it. A low groan, deep and resonant, coming from the tree itself. The ground trembled, and the roots writhed like living things. Samuel screamed, dropping to his knees while Ephraim stumbled back, tripping over a root. The lantern fell from my hands, shattering, its light snuffed out in an instant. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on Marjorie, who stood motionless, her face shadowed but serene. The hollow elm's branches creaked, bending toward her like supplicants. "You have no idea what you've woken," she said, her voice distant now, as though coming from far away. The groaning grew louder, the roots surging upward to form shapes. Faces, twisted and screaming, mouths frozen in silent agony. The air reeked of damp earth and decay. I turned and ran. We never spoke of what happened beneath the hollow elm. Tobias left town shortly after, his sister Sarah following a month later. Samuel grew quiet and withdrawn, while Ephraim took to drink. As for me, I stayed. I had no choice. My family needed me. But I never went near the tree again, not until this morning. You see, the frost has returned, though it is summer now. The fields are barren, and the livestock refuse to graze. Last night, I dreamed of Marjorie Wren, her gray eyes burning into mine. When I woke, the sound of groaning filled the air. The hollow elm is calling. The sound of groaning did not stop when I woke. It lingered in the dawn light, low and resonant, as though the tree itself had taken a breath. My first thought was that it must be the wind, but the air was still. I lay in bed for a long while, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to ignore it. My father called for me from the fields, his voice muffled by the weight of my dread. I rose, dressed, and stepped outside. The groaning was louder now. I tried to busy myself with the morning's work, feeding the chickens, mending the fence, but my hands were clumsy, my thoughts elsewhere. Every so often I found my gaze drifting toward the woods, toward the hollow elm. By midday, I could bear it no longer. The noise had settled into my bones, a vibration I couldn't shake. I told my father I needed to fetch water from the stream, though the well was full. He didn't question me, distracted as he was by the dying crops. The path to the elm was overgrown, but I knew it well enough. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted me. When I reached the clearing, the sight stopped me cold. The tree had changed. Its bark, once dark and cracked, now gleamed wetly, as if oozing sap. The roots had risen higher, twisting into shapes too deliberate to be natural. Faces. I saw them clearly now. Human faces, their features contorted in pain. And beneath the largest root, a hollow yawned wide, black and deep, like the mouth of some great beast. I should have turned back. I should have run. But the groaning pulled at me, low and insistent, And before I knew it, I was standing at the base of the tree. The air was thick, heavy with a smell I couldn't place, earthy and sour, like rotting leaves. The hollow seemed to draw me in, its darkness pressing against my skin. I knelt, my fingers brushing the edge of the opening. Something shifted inside, a whisper, soft and barely audible. My name. Elias. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The whisper came again, louder now, and with it, a voice I hadn't heard in years. Help me. It was Tobias. Tobias had left White Hollow years ago. I'd heard rumors he'd gone to sea, that he'd drowned, or perhaps found work in a distant city. But now, his voice came from the hollow, clear and desperate. Elias, it begged. Please. Tears pricked my eyes as I crawled closer. Tobias, I whispered. The groaning ceased, replaced by silence so profound it rang in my ears. Then, from the blackness, a hand emerged. It was skeletal, its flesh clinging to bone like wet parchment. I froze, unable to move, as the hand reached for me. Help me, Tobias said again, though his voice was wrong now. Too deep, too guttural. The hand grasped my wrist, its grip like iron. I screamed, pulling back, but the thing held fast. The ground beneath me shifted, the roots writhing like snakes. The hollow widened, its darkness spilling out, and for a brief moment, I saw what lay within. It was not Tobias. It was not human. A face loomed in the blackness, pale and glistening, its eyes sunken and its mouth full of jagged teeth. It grinned at me, a grin too wide, and its voice was a chorus of whispers. Stay, it said. I yanked my arm free, falling backward. The creature lunged, its hand clawing at the air, but the hollow seemed to resist it, pulling it back into the depths. The faces in the roots shifted, their mouths opening in silent screams. The groaning returned, louder now, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground. I ran. When I reached the village, I found it empty. Doors hung open, fires smoldered in hearths, but there was no sign of life. I called for my father, for anyone, but the only answer was the groaning, faint but relentless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I returned to the clearing. I don't know why. Perhaps I hoped to find answers, or perhaps some part of me knew there was no escaping it. The hollow elm loomed before me, its roots still writhing. The faces were gone now, their shapes smoothed over as though they had never been. The hollow had closed, but the air still carried the stench of decay. Marjorie Wren stood beneath the tree. She turned as I approached, her gray eyes meeting mine. You shouldn't have come back, she said. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling. What did you do to Tobias? Her expression softened, though it brought no comfort. It's not me you should fear, Elias. The tree is older than you can imagine. Older than this town, older than men. It hungers. I shook my head, unable to comprehend her words. Then why did it take him? She stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. It doesn't take, it offers. It shows you what you want most, and when you reach for it, she gestured to the hollow. I understood then. The faces in the roots, the whispers in the dark, they weren't victims. They were fools, drawn in by promises, devoured by the tree. It won't stop, Marjorie said. Not until it's fed. The ground trembled beneath us, the roots splitting open once more. The groaning grew louder, a terrible wail that shook the air. Run, Marjorie said, her voice sharp. Leave this place. But I couldn't move. The hollow yawned wide again, its blackness spilling out, and the whispers returned, calling my name. Elias, they sang. Come home. Marjorie grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Go, she shouted, while you still can. I turned and fled, the groaning chasing me all the way to the edge of the woods. I never saw Marjorie Wren again. The next morning, the villagers returned, though none could explain where they had been. The frost lifted, the crops grew green, and life in White Hollow resumed as though nothing had happened. But the hollow elm remains. Even now, as I sit by the fire, the whispers come to me, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The tree remembers, and it is hungry.